Hello everyone, good to see you guys. Happy Saturday. I'm continuing with my now almost crystallized habit of recording a video on Saturday in addition to Sunday. We'll see how that goes. I'm still not promising anything, but my Patreon supporters, they keep coming up with great suggestions, and it's just a really good and solid little dynamic we've got going on. And if I had to, refer back to the Ecstatic Soul, which is a book you can get down below on the INFJ, if you haven't got it yet, an important work on the INFJ. Dare I be that immodest? I don't know. Well, that's what I've done. But in the Ecstatic Soul, I talk about the interaction between NI and FE and how collaborative a spirit is food for NI. Well, actually, I think that lately the videos I've been making have been a perfect example of that, because I'm opening up my NI world to you, but also to my Patreon supporters who have a certain, priority as people to, suggest topics. And they've been providing so much food for thought. And basically, I've been feeding off them for the last month or so. And I hope it continues, because it's a great enterprise. I'm loving it. And today we're going to be talking about the relationship between INFJs and the supernatural. I could also talk about the relationship between the INFJs and the spiritual, or the INFJs and the metaphysical. And these terms are slightly different, obviously, but they're not slightly different. They are different, but they are also related. Is something that we're going to be exploring in this video. Just before I move on to my topic. So again, the Ecstatic Soul, also the Infinite Castle, my new novel, came out in the summer. People have been really enjoying it, finding it strange, finding it. The best quote I've had so far is from, again, Rajesh Raven, when she says, I'm a little bit concerned that I'm having this book on my bookshelf. And this is not a book I would recommend to my grandfather. So, if this is something that appeals to you and you want to hear more about INFJs in fiction, unhealthy INFJs in fiction in this case, give this book a chance, also in the link below. Now, INFJs and the supernatural, INFJs and the metaphysical, INFJs and the spiritual, was a topic recommendation by one of my Patreon supporters. Her name is Rebecca. She is a very smart person. I'm always impressed by the depth and content of her posts, and I feel like if I'm an opportunist, I can probably get many more suggestions from her and a sense of direction. Now, in her comments on my Patreon page, Rebecca was specifically talking about the place of the metaphysical in the INFJ's life, particularly in the life of introverted INFJs, but I think it certainly applies to all INFJs and to some other introverts as well, and extroverts, in fact, probably to all types, but we're going to be focusing more so on the INFJ in this video. And she was also speaking about it from the perspective of, when we are interacting with other people and with the outside world, there is this recurrent theme of, INFJs, they're very nice, and some of them, like Carl Jung, and others, they're smart and interesting, but still, there's so many of them that are just into this spiritual woo-woo stuff. And in fact, Carl Jung's failing, maybe, that's not me speaking, that's the, more sciencey people. Jung was great, but still he had to fall for this kind of woo-woo stuff as well, more toward in the latter half of his career and so on. So if only he had stuck to the more scientific Jung. And of course, INFJs and a lot of other types, again, it's not only INFJs. They think, well, actually, that's where things get interesting. That's where things transcend the inert world of matter and motion to, create the possibility of meaning for human beings. Because after all, what are we without meaning? What are we without looking for meaning? If there are some people who are happy to find meaning in mere matter and motion and clarifying its interrelationships, that's good for them, but we value that very much too. But what if we're looking for more? And what if the looking for more has its answer in something that resembles the supernatural or the metaphysical? this distinction is really evoking a lot of thoughts in my mind, because as someone who has a bit of a philosophical training, I can tell you straight, from this get-go, and some of you will know this, the metaphysical has a bad name among scientists. The supernatural has a bad name among both scientists and metaphysicians. That is, philosophers. So the most hard-nosed of all the investigators of life and the world, so what I would say would be the very sciencey scientists, by no means all scientists are like that, they would, when they speak of a metaphysical statement, what they mean is, statements that are made that are supposed to point to some truth about the world, but which cannot be verified, which cannot be observed. There's no empirical basis for them, so they're worthless, they're meaningless, they're senseless, they're whatever you want to call it. Now, from the metaphysical philosopher's perspective, the supernatural is what not only has no basis in concrete hard evidence, because if it was only that, well, nothing would distinguish it from the metaphysical, but also it doesn't necessarily follow the rules of logic. It doesn't have a coherent structure in terms of its formal properties. Something could be pointing toward the reality out there without concrete evidence, but still have reliable formal properties. I can give you a simple example of it. A typical example of a purely metaphysical argument is the argument for the existence of God that Saint Anselm came up with in the early Middle Ages, I believe, or the Middle Ages, full stop. Saint Anselm said, that's the ontological argument for the existence of God. I'll simplify it for you. He said, well, we all have ideas in our mind, right? We human beings have ideas in our mind. And among the ideas in our minds that we have, there is the idea of a supreme being who is all-powerful, who is perfect, who is self-sufficient. In other words, God. And then Anselm goes through logical process of deduction. He says, now we have that idea. It exists. But if that being was only an idea in our minds and did not exist, right? Just an idea in our mind did not exist, but then he wouldn't actually be perfect, because he would be lacking the property of existence, namely. So we have that idea in our mind, and it's a real idea. It's it's representing a being that is perfect. But for that being to be perfect, it needs to have existence, because if it didn't have existence, then it would not be perfect. So, ergo, therefore, God exists. That's a metaphysical argument, because it's not pointing to any outward external evidence of the existence of God. There's no empirics here, but it's still claiming at least to use logic, the formality of thought, representing the formality of the world, the formal properties of the world, to demonstrate that God exists. If you look at Thomas Aquinas, there's like many more metaphysical proofs of the existence of God. A familiar one is the uncaused cause, the prime mover argument first formulated by Aristotle. Says, well, if everything has a cause, we follow the simple argument, the simple framework of science, everything has a cause. Well, then, what was the first cause that started the whole process? That cause must not have had a cause. It must have been an uncaused cause. That can only be God. Again, it's an argument from thought only. It's metaphysical. The supernatural is more, again, what's called woo-woo. used to be derogatory, but I think the communities that are into the supernatural or supernatural topics, they kind of claim that for themselves. I think it's much more, it reminds me much more of like what mystics would be into, mystics of all religions and mystics of all philosophies, where it's truth of the heart as much as truth of the mind. You can't explain it, and you can't even explain it by means of logical arguments. In fact, from that mystical perspective, the aridity of the logical arguments sort of misses the mark and misses the point. It's like, and there is really a sense in which, like, providing an argument for the existence of God by this reference to, you know, it's an idea in your mind, it has to exist. It's like, well, you know, maybe that's an intellectual achievement, but aren't you just missing the whole point and meaning of what God, the truth of God is for people who believe in God? Like, are you not just really dry and missing the heart and the real contents of the whole concept? So where do INFJs fit in there? In my book, it's true that I talk about the role of metaphysical conceptions in the life of the INFJ. But I could equally have talked about the role of supernatural conceptions. You know, it's the thing about, or mystical conceptions. It's true that supernatural has a bit of a bad name, and you have to handle it carefully, I suppose, because it could easily be misinterpreted as, oh, like believing in UFOs. In fact, Jung wrote entire essays and books about UFOs, so, you know, they wouldn't be so unusual for INFJs either. But, you know, also like the Earth is flat and all that kind of stuff. So I think mystical is probably a better way to encapsulate it. And I think that one thing that all mystics seem to have in common is that they are not dualists in their philosophy, in their philosophical worldview. They tend to think that everything is one, everything is connected, everything is oneness. They may arrive at different perspectives on what it is that unites everything. Is it God, or is it a particular substance? Like everything is spirit, everything is consciousness, or everything is heart. You know, there's lots of ways of looking at it, but mystics all seem to have that idea of oneness in them. The metaphysical, by contrast, is a worldview which is, again, more philosophical, more formal. It usually comes from more training and from taking a more detached stance on the phenomenon of life and the phenomenon of existence and of the world. It can be monistic, again, all is one, but it's not monistic in the same sense that, the mystics are monistic. And oftentimes, metaphysical worldviews are not monistic. They're dualistic. At least they separate matter and mind. And sometimes they're pluralistic. They separate a lot of different types of being, categories of being. And I think that INFJs tend to be monistic. I think enlightened INFJs, to use vocabulary from my book, tend to be monistic more in the mystical sense than in the metaphysical sense. I think it's possible to suggest a hypothesis that the more alienated you are as an INFJ, the more dualistic you will tend to be. Doesn't apply in all cases, but the more dualistic you'll tend to be, because you'll be very much introverted into the world of fantasy, because you're not really adapting to life very well. So by the compensation for the failure to adapt to life is an over-investment into the realm of fantasy activity. So you're creating this whole fantasy world of your own, which you can navigate freely, but the outside world is actually more and more difficult to navigate. I think that actually this does not lead to mysticism. This leads more likely to philosophical dualism, where the internal worlds of ideas, of fantasy, of the internal psychic world, is overvalued at the expense of the external material world. So the material world is the foil that has to be devalued, so that the world of fantasy, where we thrive, where we alienated INFJs thrive, is overvalued. So it's not actually a balanced view. But again, I've warned before, or maybe warn is too strong a word, but I've talked before about how it's easy for an INFJ to relate to their NI as if like, oh, I'm so mystical, I've attained wisdom. It's like, no, you're probably just overvaluing your own wisdom and your own visions by failing to actually value what needs to be valued in your existence, in your life, which is the external world of matter, SC and all that, but also other people, interactions, FE and all that. So I think that's actually dualism. It might not recognize itself as dualist, it might not know itself as dualist, but alienation is usually dualist because you alienate it from something and you value what remains with you, okay, and what you invest in, the internal world. Maybe the philosophical metaphysics of monism, like where you think everything is one, is more of a stage towards full-blown mystic oneness, which would be the most enlightened state, where all is one and you don't even have to create intellectual systems to convince yourself of it. It's more a relation of the heart toward the subject matter, where you commit your whole being to that, you know. And of course, from the perspective of other people, that might seem woo-woo. It might seem like it's something that doesn't have a basis in logic. And in fact, you know, that's exactly what happened with Jung. You know, a lot of people at the time and even to this day think, well, you know, Jung was great, but he became more woo-woo. I think that actually that was probably the culmination of his path of individuation, where you begin to see the world just with a different pair of eyes, really, you know, and you it's not so much that you think that the intellect doesn't matter anymore. It's just that the intellect is just one faculty among others, and it doesn't take precedence. People who value the intellect enormously are going to continue making fun of those INFJs and other types that attain to those higher states, but you know, they're speaking from their perspective. It's not even that they're wrong or that they're right, it's that they're speaking from their perspective. It's hard for me to speak with authority about other types and how they relate to the question of what the world is like in its innermost essence. Is it just one big interconnected web that is supernatural in the sense that it's more than just what nature seems to give us? There's something more to it. INFJs relate to the supernatural in a way that I think I described well in the Ecstatic Soul, I think, and that I'm building on in this video and hopefully in other videos, because I'm kind of improvising a little bit in this, you know, sharing my thoughts spontaneously. But I imagine that for other types, the relationships are going to have a lot of common traits, but also differences in how they are negotiated, because the existential constitution of every type is going to be different, given different makeups, functional makeups, you know. So for the INFJ, I think that the supernatural and the, you know, it represents two possible avenues. It might suggest that you're actually very alienated and stuck in an over evaluation of the world of supernatural fantasy, in which case get a grip and engage with the external world. But it can also signify a later stage where you've engaged in those collaborative, meaningful enterprises, and you're going back into this idea of oneness, mature idea of mystical oneness. It's been a long time since I started talking, so I'll finish here. I might continue with this topic tomorrow, or talk again about FE. Don't forget that I have this Patreon page, and I'll see you tomorrow, guys. Bye-bye.